Okay, we know that, as like new generation type thing, you guys don't really talk a lot. You like text and do all that kind of stuff. Those are conversations. So we thought that we would get up here and kind of talk to you like we used to. So that's what we're doing here. Please join in if you feel like it. Okay?
Hashtag, it's our party.
Hey, hashtag, we can say what we want.
Hashtag, we can do what we want.
We use hashtags all the time.
Hashtag, hell yeah!
You guys go to the game today?
Hashtag midfield hockey.
Hashtag kicked ass.
Hashtag, putting foot on the gas.
Hashtag, super senior class.
Hashtag Hamilton may take a pass.
You know it's senior weekend.
Hashtag it's a holiday.
Hashtag, left treaty in disarray.
Hashtag this ain't Zimbabwe.
Hashtag, risque.
Hashtag, did you see Miley on the VMAs?
Hashtag
Hey.
Hashtag Dino.
Hashtag Conman.
Hashtag Duke. Hashtag Mayor Bear.
Hashtag KT.
Hashtag, smelly Ellie.
Yeah. There's 6 seniors this year, most since 2006.
Hashtag Super 6.
Hashtag, picking up sticks.
Hashtag love to get their kicks.
Hashtag, brownie mix.
Hashtag 6 chicks.
Hashtag 6 chicks without. Well, 3 years ago, we all called them the Freshy Fresh.
Hashtag in the flesh.
Hashtag, hit me refresh.
Hashtag, big bowl of creme fraiche.
Hashtag we're not in Bangladesh.
Hashtag sticking together like Velcro.
Hashtag which one's Elmo?
Hashtag's always in the know.
Hashtag, there's always snow.
Hashtag, garlic, butter, and escargot.
Hashtag Sheryl Crow.
Hashtag Vincent Van Gogh.
Hashtag, Henry David Thoreau.
Hashtag no, Meredith Rowe.
Hashtag quid pro quo.
Hashtag we're gonna need a wheelbarrow.
First up, we're talking about is Ellie.
Hashtag, field hockey Botticelli. Hashtag, peanut butter and jelly.
Hashtag, doing her twirl. Hashtag, she's a mother of pearl. Hashtag, hey girl. Hashtag, she better not hurl.
Hashtag, show mommy you like. Hashtag, have you ever seen her spit? Hashtag, pure Brit.
Hashtag, hey what? Hashtag, butt. Hashtag, absurd dance strut. Hashtag, open and shut. Hashtag, never interrupt.
Hashtag, soul singer. Hashtag, not a right winger. Hashtag, English Springer.
Hashtag, the talent has arrived. Hashtag, eyes on the prize. Hashtag, forehand drive. Hashtag, Jackson 5.
Next up, Meredith Rowe.
Hashtag she's got a stare. Hashtag block tackle extraordinaire. Hashtag leaving offense in despair. Hashtag Obamacare.
Hashtag last shower every day. Hashtag sassy shopping sway. Hashtag no gluten or way. Hashtag toilet paper skirt. Hashtag never been hurt. Hashtag always pert. Hashtag holds the offense in contempt of Kurt.
Hashtag genuine. Hashtag defensive boundary line. Hashtag strong spine.
Hashtag sweet queen. Hashtag save queen. Hashtag ice cream. Hashtag never mean.
Hashtag jacked up on caffeine. Hashtag making defensive saves like a cash machine. Hashtag defensive fiend. Hashtag did someone say jelly bean? Hashtag I hear she dressing in the latrine.
Next up, Sandra Poole.
Hashtag HD. Hashtag duty, hashtag doodles, hashtag doodle pants. Hashtag did she go to France? Hashtag you should see her do a clog dance. Hashtag big romance.
Hashtag super fast, hashtag always a blast, hashtag unabashed, hashtag 27th President of the U.S., William Howard Taft.
Hashtag determined, hashtag raise the curtain, hashtag party vice chairman, hashtag Spreckens adjournment.
Hashtag field hockey alternative hipster, hashtag balling like a gangster, hashtag like a big sister, hashtag decent kisser, hashtag watch out for the fever blister.
Hashtag always smiling, hashtag never fighting, hashtag forever styling, hashtag energizing.
Next up, Katie Tice.
Hashtag KITIE, hashtag stinging like a bumblebee, hashtag sweet pea, hashtag Yahtzee.
Hashtag smiles shine, hashtag like a dollar sign, hashtag never in a straight line, hashtag hands are mighty fine, hashtag freckles time, hashtag you got to do the hashtag sign.
Hashtag red, hashtag thoroughbred, hashtag cinnamon bread, hashtag do you watch The Walking Dead,
Hashtag so cute, hashtag always a hoot, hashtag laughing through her snoot, hashtag taking shots like it's Beirut.
hashtag biggest spaz at mid, hashtag like a little kid, hashtag sometimes she goes off the grid.
Hashtag what's done is done, hashtag full of fun, hashtag never outdone.
Hashtag ball of fire, hashtag live wire, hashtag environmental squire, hashtag unending desire.
Next, D. Miller.
Hashtag Dino, hashtag Dieters, hashtag Dino Puppy,
Hashtag diesel, hashtag always lethal, hashtag going medieval, hashtag no equal, hashtag pack leader.
hashtag I got a hunger I just can't satiate, hashtag doesn't have to worry about the unemployment rate, hashtag where's that sandwich plate, hashtag no debate, hashtag her hair is freaking great.
Hashtag Jesus has wheels, hashtag Johnny's head over heels, hashtag gentler than a first seal, hashtag stronger than tungsten steel, hashtag flexible like a moray eel.
Hashtag horse, hashtag tour de force, hashtag always right, hashtag never has stage fright, hashtag wearing convent white.
And next, Hannah Khan.
Hashtag Hannah Banana, hashtag hand, hashtag con man, hashtag always has a plan, hashtag in hand a beer can, hashtag handyman.
Hashtag invented block tackle, hashtag her knees go crackle crackle, hashtag walks like she just got off a saddle.
Hashtag best DJ, hashtag never goes halfway, hashtag Jesus doesn't use hairspray, hashtag deserves sick pay, hashtag such a good cook it's scary, hashtag proud Mary, hashtag Tom and Jerry, hashtag Mo and Larry, hashtag sings like a canary.
Hashtag so amazing, hashtag inspiration.
Hashtag soccer mom, hashtag known for stink bombs. Hashtag life is a sitcom, hashtag no practical joke, hashtag always spreading the stoke. Okay, well, we're almost done here. We're really here to celebrate the 6 girls, the commitment they made to the team, to the sport, the program, and to each other.
Hashtag dedication,
Hashtag fixation,
Hashtag admiration,
Hashtag adoration,
Hashtag personification.
hashtag higher education,
hashtag diversification,
hashtag free association,
hashtag hopefully not constipation,
hashtag synchronization,
Hashtag recuperation.
hashtag proliferation,
hashtag gratification,
hashtag animation,
hashtag intoxication,
hashtag emancipation proclamation,
Hashtag ultraviolet radiation.
hashtag transformation,
hashtag appreciation,
hashtag codification,
hashtag subluxation,
hashtag perspiration,
Hashtag motivation.
hashtag harmonization,
hashtag orchestration,
Hashtag sophistication.
Hashtag fascination.
Hashtag experimentation.
Hashtag social organization.
Hashtag refrigeration.
Hashtag no abbreviation.
Hashtag pasteurization.
Hashtag coronation.
Hashtag holy day of obligation.
Hashtag elevation.
Hashtag germination.
Hashtag beat generation.
Hashtag jubilation.
Hashtag infatuation.
Hashtag gyration.
Hashtag no limitation.
Hashtag realization.
Hashtag graduation.
Hashtag tribulation.
Hashtag illumination.
Hashtag Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Hashtag determination.
Hashtag personification.
Hashtag reverberation.
Hashtag standing ovation.